softly, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup, the warmth of the tea cradled in your hands, the room dim and peaceful. Let the steam rise from the cup softly, the room dim and peaceful. Let the day slip away. Tonight we have a calm little mystery, one that unfolds like petals in the morning light, with our old friend Miss Marple to guide us. No hurry, no haste, simply listen, breathe and enjoy. If these gentle tales bring you comfort, do consider subscribing for more. There are always more quiet evenings waiting. It was a soft spring dawn in St. Mary Mead, the kind of Easter morning when the world seems newly washed and hopeful. Church bells rang gently across the fields, lilies stood white in every window, and families walked to services in their best clothes. Yet among all this gentle renewal, one small thing caught the eye, if one knew where to look. A single act, so quiet it might be missed, had ended something forever. And that ending, well, that was the killing. Chapter 1, The Quiet Beginning. The afternoon of Easter Saturday in St. Mary Mead was one of those rare, perfect days that seem almost too gentle to be true. The sky was a pale washed blue, the sort that makes you think of old china plates left too long in the sun. A light breeze moved through the village, carrying the faint sweetness of early lilacs and the distant promise of rain that would never quite arrive. Birds called to one another from the hedgerows, unhurried, as though they too understood that tomorrow was Easter Sunday and there was no need to rush. Miss Jane Marple sat in the small wicker chair in her garden, just outside the French windows of her drawing room. A low table beside her held a pot of tea, still warm under its knitted cosy, a cup and saucer, and a plate with 2 digestive biscuits she had not yet touched. In her lap lay her knitting, a soft grey shawl of fine wool, the pattern simple but elegant, row upon row of stocking stitch with just a touch of lace at the edges. Her needles moved steadily, click, click, a quiet rhythm that matched the slow turning of the afternoon. She had spent the morning at the church, as she did every year at this time. The vicar, Mr. Haydock, always asked for her help with the Easter decorations, knowing her eye for harmony and her gentle way with flowers. Together with Mrs. Price from the post office and young Emily Waters, they had filled the nave with white lilies, daffodils forced early in the greenhouse behind the vicarage, and branches of forsythia that spilled golden light across the pews. The altar cloth had been freshly laundered and ironed, the brass candlesticks polished until they caught every stray sunbeam. Hymn sheets had been printed and stacked neatly on the table by the door, each one bearing the familiar words of Jesus Christ is risen today and the strife is o'er. Everything had been as it should be. The church smelled of wax and flowers and old wood warmed by sunlight. The 3 women had worked companionably, chatting of small things, the new curtains in the vestry, the price of sugar at the shop, how quickly the children grew. Mrs. Price, a stout woman of 60, with a kind but perpetually worried face, had arranged the lilies with quick practised hands. Emily Waters, barely 19, had moved more slowly, her fingers lingering on the petals as though reluctant to let them go. She wore a faint cloud of lilac scent that drifted after her like a memory. Miss Marple had noticed these things, of course. She always noticed, not in any prying way, she disliked prying, but in the quiet, observant manner of someone who has lived a long time among the same people and learned to read the small signs they leave behind. Mrs. Price had glanced more than once toward the churchyard gate while they worked, her eyes searching the path that led down to the lane, as though waiting for someone who was already late. She had said little about it, only murmured once, almost to herself, "I do hope the weather holds for tomorrow. Easter morning should be bright." Emily, meanwhile, had been quieter than usual. Unnormally, she chattered about her younger brothers, about the new film at the cinema in Much Benham, about the dress she was making for Whitsun. Today she had answered politely but briefly, her smile a little fixed. When Miss Marple had asked after her aunt, who had been unwell, Emily had simply said, "She's resting, thank you, Miss Marple," and turned back to the flowers. After the decorations were finished, they had all stood for a moment in the aisle, admiring their work. The vicar had appeared from the vestry, beaming, and thanked them warmly. "It looks splendid, ladies, quite splendid. A fitting welcome for the risen Lord." Then he had hurried off to check the organist's music, and the 3 women had walked out together into the churchyard. There, under the ancient yew trees, Mrs. Price had paused. She looked at the war memorial, the simple stone cross with its list of names from 2 wars, and her hand had gone briefly to her throat. "Easter always makes one think," she said softly. "How quickly things can change. One moment alive and laughing, the next, gone." Her voice had trailed away, and she had given a small apologetic smile, as though embarrassed by her own words. Emily had said nothing, only looked down at the grass. Miss Marple had nodded gently. Yes, she agreed. It does make one think. They had parted then, Mrs. Price to the post office to lock up for the holiday, Emily to her aunt's cottage at the edge of the green. Miss Marple had walked home slowly, enjoying the warmth on her shoulders and the sight of children running with Easter eggs wrapped in bright foil. She had passed old Mr. Harraway's cottage, at the one with the overgrown hedge and the gate that never quite latched properly. The curtains had been drawn, as they often were, and no smoke rose from the chimney. Mr. Harraway, kept to himself, had done so for years. A quiet man, a little abrupt, but never unkind. Now, back in her garden, Miss Marple let her knitting rest in her lap for a moment. She looked across the low wall to the lane beyond, where a boy on a bicycle wobbled past with a basket of primroses. The village lay peaceful around her, chimneys smoking gently, windows open to catch the breeze, the faint sound of a wireless playing somewhere down the road. Tomorrow the bells would ring for the early service, families would walk to church in their Sunday best, and the children would hunt for eggs in the vicarage garden after the service. Yet something very small, felt just a fraction out of place. Not wrong exactly, not alarming, just not quite as it usually was. Like a picture frame that has been hung 1/16 of an inch too high. Nothing one could put a finger on at first, but once seen, impossible to ignore. Miss Marple picked up her needles again. Click, click. The shawl grew longer by slow degrees. She thought of Mrs. Price's glance toward the gate, of Emily's quietness, of the war memorial standing silent under the yews. She thought of Mr. Harraway's closed curtains and empty chimney. And she thought of Easter itself, the day of resurrection, of life returning after death, of endings that become beginnings. She smiled a little to herself, the smile of someone who has lived long enough to know that human hearts are rarely as simple as they seem. Now tomorrow morning she would go to church as usual. She would listen to the hymns, watch the faces of her neighbours, and let the small details settle into place, the way pieces of a puzzle find their spots without force. For now, though, there was tea to finish, knitting to continue, and the soft afternoon light to enjoy. The mystery, if mystery it was, could wait. Mysteries, in Miss Marple's experience, were like gardens, best observed patiently, in their own time. She reached for her cup, took a sip, and resumed her steady knitting. The shawl would be finished soon. And tomorrow was Easter Sunday. Chapter 2. Something slightly unusual. Easter Sunday dawned as gently as anyone could wish. The first light slipped over the hills behind St. Mary Mead, like pale silk drawn across the sky. Lanes were dotted with figures. In their Sunday best, women in spring coats and neat hats, men in dark suits brushed the night before, children skipping ahead with Easter baskets already half full of chocolate eggs wrapped in gold and silver foil. Miss Marple walked to the 11 o'clock service at the usual hour, her best hat, a soft grey felt with a single velvet ribbon, set squarely on her white hair. She carried her small prayer book in one gloved hand and a folded handkerchief in the other. The air was cool but bright, scented with damp earth and the sharp green smell of new grass. Daffodils nodded along garden walls, and every cottage window showed a vase of white lilies or narcissi, as though the whole village had agreed to wear the same modest colours for the day. Inside the church, everything was just as they had left it the day before. The lilies stood tall in their brass vases. The forsythia branches caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows, and the altar glowed softly with candles newly lit. The congregation filled the pews slowly, murmuring greetings, the rustle of hymn books, and the occasional small cough, the only sounds before the organ began its voluntary. Miss Marple took her usual place 3 rows from the front on the left, beside the aisle, where she could see both the chancel and most of the nave without turning her head. The service unfolded with familiar beauty. The vicar, Mr. Haydock, I read the gospel of the empty tomb in his calm, measured voice. The choir, small but earnest, sang the opening hymn with special care, the descant rising clear above the rest on the final verse. When the time came for the collection, the plates moved quietly from hand to hand, coins chinking softly. Miss Marple dropped in her usual 2 shillings and 6pence, wrapped neatly in a scrap of tissue paper, and passed the plate along. After the blessing, people lingered in the pews a moment longer than usual, as though reluctant to leave the warmth and light of the church for the open air. Then, one by one, they filed out through the porch, shaking the vicar's hand, exchanging quiet happy Easters. Outside on the lawn, the trestle tables were already set with urns of coffee and tea, trays of hot cross buns still warm from the oven at the baker's, and a few plates of shortbread contributed by various ladies of the parish. Miss Marple accepted a cup of coffee from Mrs. Bantry, who had driven over from Gossington, especially for the day, and stood with her near the yew hedge, watching the little knots of people form and dissolve. Children ran in circles, showing off their eggs. Elderly couples sat on the wooden benches under the trees. Young mothers balanced cups and babies with practised ease. It was then that she noticed him. Mr. Harraway stood a little apart from the crowd, near the low stone wall that separated the churchyard from the lane. He was dressed as always in his old tweed coat and flat cap, the coat a shade too large now that he had grown thinner over the years. In his hands he held no cup, no bun, nothing of the Easter refreshments. Instead he carried a small posy, no more than 6 or 7 stems, of wild violets, the deep purple kind that grew thick in the damp hedgerows beyond his cottage. Their leaves were still damp with morning dew. He did not speak to anyone. He simply walked the few steps to the war memorial, the plain stone cross with its bronze plaque listing the names of the fallen, and bent slowly to place the violets at its foot. He arranged them with care, spreading the stems so the small flowers faced upward, then straightened again. For a moment he stood quite still, looking down at the memorial as though reading the names one by one, though Miss Marple knew he had long since memorized them all. Then he turned, walked back across the grass, passed through the lich gate without a glance at the coffee tables, and disappeared down the lane toward his cottage. No one else appeared to have noticed. The chatter continued, the children laughed, the vicar moved among his parishioners with a gentle word here and there. Mrs. Price was busy pouring more coffee, her cheeks flushed from the steam. Emily Waters stood near the porch steps, talking quietly to her aunt, but her eyes followed Mr. Harraway's retreating figure for a second longer than necessary before she looked away. Miss Marple sipped her coffee. It was weak, the way she liked it on such occasions, and the warmth of the cup was pleasant against her fingers. She thought back to the day before. Mr. Harraway's curtains drawn, his chimney cold. She remembered, too, something he had said years ago, In one of his rare conversations at the village fete, a dry remark about remembrance days and how some things are best left alone. He had lost a brother in the First War. Everyone knew that, though he never spoke of it. Tom Haraway, killed in France in 1917. The name was there on the memorial, third from the bottom on the left-hand column, yet here was Mr. Haraway, on Easter morning of all days, bringing flowers to a memorial he had always ignored. Not poppies in November, not a wreath at armistice, but violets, small, modest, almost hidden, on the day the church celebrated life triumphing over death. She set her cup down on the nearest table and walked a few paces closer to the memorial herself, pretending to adjust the position of a daffodil that had slipped in its vase on the windowsill nearby. From there she could see the violets clearly, their petals still fresh, their scent faint but sweet when the breeze stirred. No card, no ribbon, nothing to explain them. Just the flowers, placed with quiet intention. Miss Marple returned to her place beside Mrs. Bantry, who was now telling a long story about her gardener's troubles with slugs. She listened with half an ear, nodding at the right moments, but her mind had moved elsewhere. Something had shifted in the village this morning, something very small and very private. Not a crime, not a scandal. Nothing so dramatic, but a change all the same. A door long closed had opened, if only by an inch, and a breath of new air had moved through. She glanced once more toward the lane where Mr. Haraway had gone. The path was empty now, the grass already springing back where his boots had pressed. Easter morning, she thought, was a day for many kinds of rising. Some rose from graves in scripture stories. Others rose from graves of their own making, quieter ones, deeper ones, carried inside for decades. Chapter 3. Gentle Observations. The days after Easter slipped by in the unhurried way that early spring days have in St. Mary Mead. The daffodils began to fade a little at the edges, giving way to tulips pushing up through the borders. The evenings grew longer, the light softer. Miss Marple returned to her usual small routines, a walk to the village shops each morning with her string bag, a cup of tea with whoever happened to call, an hour or two in the garden pulling weeds or tying up sweet peas against the trellis. Yet beneath this calm surface, she continued to notice, not with effort, but in the natural way one notices the changing colour of leaves or the first cuckoo call of the season. On the Tuesday following Easter, she met Mrs. Price outside the post office. The older woman was locking the door for the midday break, her keys jingling softly. She looked tired, Miss Marple thought, though she smiled as always. "Good morning, Jane," Mrs. Price said. "Did you enjoy the service?" The vicar was in fine voice, wasn't he? "Very fine," Miss Marple agreed. "And the flowers lasted beautifully. I noticed you've been busy since. I saw fresh water in the vases yesterday when I passed." Mrs. Price nodded. "Emily came in early Monday to change them. She's good that way, quiet but thorough, though she's been a bit down, poor child. Her aunt's cough is no better. And Emily worries." They walked a few steps together along the pavement. Miss Marple asked after the aunt, a Mrs. Simpkins who lived in the row of cottages behind the green, and Mrs. Price gave the usual polite details: doctor's visits, hot lemon and honey, rest. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Funny thing about Mr. Haraway, though. I saw him in church again last evening. Not for evensong, just sitting in the back pew after everyone had gone. I was locking up the vestry, and there he was, quite still, looking at the east window. I didn't like to disturb him, so I left him there. When I came back half an hour later, he was gone. Miss Marple made a small sound of interest. He's been coming more often lately, hasn't he? So it seems. Not to pray exactly, at least not the way most do. He just sits. Sometimes he brings a book, but mostly he just looks. I asked him once if he needed anything, and he said no, thank you. He was remembering properly for once. Whatever that means. They parted at the corner, Mrs. Price turning toward her house with a wave, Miss Marple continuing to the butcher's for a small joint. As she waited her turn, she overheard two women discussing the same man in low voices. Never used to come near the place except Remembrance Sunday, and then only because everyone else did. Perhaps the Easter message got through to him at last. Better late than never. Miss Marple paid for her meat, exchanged pleasantries with Mr. Curtis behind the counter, and walked home thinking, remembering properly. An odd phrase. She filed it away with the rest. Later that week she called on Emily Waters. The girl opened the door of her aunt's cottage herself, looking pale but composed. She invited Miss Marple in for a cup of tea. Auntie's resting upstairs, but she'd be pleased to know you called. And they sat in the small parlour where the fire burned low. On the mantelpiece stood the same framed photograph Miss Marple had glimpsed before. A young man in uniform, cap tilted at a jaunty angle, smiling broadly at the camera. The frame was polished, the glass spotless. Your uncle, wasn't it? Miss Marple asked gently, nodding toward the picture. Emily followed her gaze. Yes, Uncle Robert. He was killed in 1918, just before the end. Auntie never quite got over it. She keeps his photo there, so he's still part of the room. And you? You were very small when he died, I think. I was too. I don't remember him, but I feel as though I do. He from the stories. He and Mr. Harraway's brother were friends. They joined up together, trained together. Letters came home about them both. Then one day the telegrams arrived almost the same week. Emily spoke quietly, without tears, but with a kind of steady sadness that had settled deep. Miss Marple sipped her tea and let the silence stretch comfortably. I noticed you take the long way round the green now, she said after a moment. You used to cut past the war memorial on your way to the church. Emily looked down at her cup. Yes, I do. It's silly, perhaps, but standing there, reading the names, it feels heavy sometimes. Like the war never really ended for some people. For Auntie, mostly. She still sets a place for him at Christmas, you know. Just a small plate, but it's there. Miss Marple nodded. Grief has its own habits. They're hard to change. Emily gave a small smile. Mr. Harraway brought violets on Easter morning. I saw him from the porch. I almost went over to speak, but I didn't know what to say. He looked different somehow. Not sad exactly, just finished with something. They talked a little longer about the garden, about the new lambs in the field behind the cottages, and then Miss Marple took her leave, promising to bring some of her homemade elderflower cordial for the invalid aunt. As she walked home, the pieces began to settle more clearly in her mind, though still without sharp edges. Mr. Harraway sitting alone in the church, not praying but remembering. The violets at the memorial, placed on the one day of the year when death and life were spoken of in the same breath. Emily avoiding the very place where her uncle's name was carved. Mrs. Price's husband had served in the same battalion as the Harraway brothers and young Robert Simpkins. She had once mentioned, years ago, how the four of them had been thick as thieves before the war took them all in different ways. None of it pointed to anything dramatic. No theft, no scandal, no sudden tragedy. Yet the pattern was there, quiet and persistent, like the slow turning of seasons. Something long carried, a weight, a silence, an old unhealed sore, had begun to shift on Easter morning, not because of any great event, but because one man had chosen, in the hush of resurrection hymns, to lay it down. That evening Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting. The grey shawl was nearly finished now, only the border remained. She worked steadily, the needles moving in their calm rhythm. Outside, the village settled into dusk, lights coming on in cottage windows, the faint sound of a wireless playing a concert from London, a dog barking once and then falling silent. She thought of the war memorial under the yews, the names fixed forever in bronze. She thought of violets wilting gently against the stone, their colour fading, but their meaning lingering. And she thought how strange it was, and how right, that the smallest acts of release could sometimes feel the most profound. Tomorrow she would call on Mrs. Bantry at Gossington for tea. Perhaps there would be more to hear, more small details to add to the quiet picture forming in her mind. For now, though, she was content to let the evening unfold as it would. Mysteries, she had long since learned, revealed themselves best when one did not press too hard. She finished the row, he turned the work, and began the next. Click, click, the fire crackled softly. The night outside was peaceful. Chapter 4. A Calm Contradiction. The middle of the week brought a soft April rain to St. Mary Mead, the kind that falls steadily but without drama, soaking the gardens and making the lanes glisten under grey skies. Miss Marple did not mind. She liked the sound of rain on the roof tiles and the way it freshened the air through an open window. That afternoon she decided to take a small pot of her homemade rhubarb and ginger jam to Mrs. Price, a neighbourly gesture, and also an opportunity to sit for half an hour by a warm fire and listen. Mrs. Price welcomed her with the usual pleased surprise. "Jane, come in, come in. I've just put the kettle on. You'll have a cup? Won't you?" They settled in the small sitting room at the back of the post office house, where the windows overlooked a neat patch of lawn and a row of runner beans already climbing their strings. The fire crackled comfortably. Mrs. Price poured tea from a brown earthenware pot and passed the sugar basin. They spoke first of ordinary things, the rain holding off the tulips, the new bus timetable from Much Benham, young Tommy from the dairy who had taken a bad cold. Then, as the conversation naturally drifted, Mrs. Price sighed and set her cup down. "I saw Mr. Harraway again this morning," she said. "He came in for his pension. First time in weeks he's spoken more than 2 words. He asked if the violets were still at the memorial. I told him they'd wilted a bit with the rain, but I'd put fresh water yesterday when I passed." He nodded. I said, "Good," and then, quite out of the blue, he said, "They weren't for the memorial, you know. Not really." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows just a fraction. "Not for the memorial?" "No." Mrs. Price leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice though they were quite alone. "He said they were for someone who died long ago, but only just now properly laid to rest. I didn't know what to make of it. I asked if he meant his brother Tom. Everyone knows the names on the stone. And he gave this small tired smile and said, 'Yes, Tom, but mostly for the anger I carried all these years, I killed it on Easter morning. Finally. She sat back, looking puzzled. I thought at first he was being fanciful. You know how some old gentlemen get. But he was quite calm, quite certain. He said the war took Tom in 1917, and he'd blamed everyone and everything ever since. The generals, the government, even himself, for not being there. He'd nursed that bitterness like a sick child, he said, and it had kept him apart from people, from joy, from living. Then, during the Easter service, hearing the vicar speak of forgiveness and new life, something gave way. He chose to let it go. Right there in the pew, he called it his killing, the killing of the old resentment, and the violets were to mark the grave of it. Miss Marple listened without interrupting, her hands folded quietly in her lap. The rain tapped steadily against the window pane. When Mrs. Price finished, she waited a moment before speaking. So the flowers were not a tribute to the dead, Miss Marple said gently, but a sign that something dead had at last been buried. Exactly. Mrs. Price gave a small, bewildered laugh. I thought at first it was some sort of tragedy on Easter morning, something dark, something final. Everyone assumes killing means a life taken, doesn't one? Especially when it's tied to a day like that. But he meant the opposite. Not a person killed, but a poison killed. An old slow poison he'd carried inside himself for nearly 40 years. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Here, then, was the calm contradiction at the heart of it all. The title everyone might have imagined. The Easter morning killing suggested violence, sudden and shocking, a life ended on the very day the church proclaimed life victorious over death. Yet the truth was quieter, deeper, almost the reverse. Not a life taken, but a long-held deathliness released. Not murder, but mercy. Not an ending forced upon someone, but an ending chosen by one man for the sake of his own soul, and perhaps for the peace of those around him. She thought of the war memorial, the names fixed in bronze, unchanging. She thought of the violets, small and perishable, laid at the foot of that unchanging stone. A symbol, yes, but not of grief renewed, rather of grief finally set aside. Mr. Harraway had not come to mourn again. He had come to say farewell to mourning itself. Mrs. Price refilled their cups. I asked him if he felt different now. He said yes, lighter, like a man who's carried a heavy pack for miles and at last sets it down. He even said he might start coming to the Thursday teas at the vicarage. Imagine that. Mr. Harraway at tea with the ladies. They both smiled at the picture. Miss Marple took a sip of tea, feeling the warmth spread through her. The contradiction was now plain. What had seemed on the surface to be a dark act tied to Easter morning was in truth an act of quiet liberation. The killing had taken place in silence, in the space between one hymn and the next, in the heart of a solitary man, listening to words he had heard many times before, but only now allowed to reach him. She stayed another quarter of an hour, talking of lighter things, the new seedlings in her garden, the price of coal, before thanking Mrs. Price for the tea and stepping out into the rain. She opened her umbrella, a sturdy black one with a curved handle, and walked home slowly along the wet pavements. The village looked soft and blurred under the drizzle, cottage roofs shining, gardens drinking deeply, the green on the common glistening like velvet. Miss Marple passed the war memorial without stopping, but she glanced at the spot where the violets had been. They were gone now, washed away or cleared by the sexton, but their meaning remained. She reached her own gate, shook the rain from her umbrella, and let herself in. The house was warm, the fire laid ready in the grate. She hung her coat, changed her shoes, and sat for a moment in her favourite chair by the window, watching the rain trace slow patterns down the glass. The pieces were coming together now, not with drama or haste, but with the steady certainty of a tide turning. What had begun as a small, slightly unusual gesture on Easter morning, a posy of violets placed where none had ever been placed before, had revealed itself as the outward sign of an inward change. The killing was real, but it was the killing of something that had needed to die. Bitterness, isolation, the long refusal to forgive. Miss Marple picked up her knitting from the basket beside her chair. The grey shawl was finished now, except for the final edging. She threaded the needle with wool and began to sew, stitch by careful stitch. Outside the rain continued, gentle and unhurried. Inside the fire burned low and steady. All was quiet, thoughtful, and, for the first time in many years, when Mr. Harroway was concerned, at peace. Chapter 5. A detail revisited. The rain cleared by Thursday morning, leaving the village washed and sparkling under a pale sun. Puddles on the lanes reflected blue sky and white clouds. The air smelled of wet earth and opening blossom. Miss Marple rose early, as she often did on such fresh days, and after a light breakfast of toast and marmalade, she put on her sensible walking shoes and set out for the churchyard. She carried no basket or flowers, only her small prayer book and the quiet intention of looking again at what she had already seen. The church stood peaceful as ever, its stone warmed by the morning light. The door was unlocked. Mr. Hardock liked it that way during daylight hours, so she stepped inside. The nave was empty, save for the faint scent of lilies still lingering from Easter, and the soft creak of old floorboards under her feet. She walked slowly down the aisle, past the pew where Mr. Harroway had sat on that Sunday, and out through the south door into the churchyard. The yew trees cast long dappled shadows across the graves. The war memorial stood as it always had, solid and silent, its bronze plaque catching glints of sunlight. Miss Marple approached it without haste. The violets were long gone, of course, cleared away or dissolved by the rain. But she hadn't come to look for them. She had come to look at something she had noticed only in passing on Easter morning, something small enough to be overlooked unless one paused deliberately. There, half hidden beneath a flat stone at the base of the cross, the sort of stone placed to keep the grass tidy around the memorial, lay a folded piece of paper, pale blue, slightly damp from the ground but still legible. She did not pick it up. That would have felt intrusive. Instead, she bent a little, steadying herself with one hand on the stone, and read what she could from where she stood. The handwriting was careful, the letters formed by someone unused to writing long notes. My brother Tom, I let you go today. Easter morning. The old anger is dead. I forgive the war, the generals, myself. Rest now. No more carrying. Your brother Arthur. Below the signature was a single pressed violet, its colour faded to a soft lavender shadow on the paper. The note had been there since Easter, protected by the stone, waiting, perhaps, for someone to notice, or perhaps never meant to be found at all. Miss Marple straightened slowly. She felt no surprise, only the gentle satisfaction of a detail falling neatly into place. The note confirmed what Mr. Harraway had told Mrs. Price in his quiet way. The killing had been internal, deliberate, complete. But it also brought back another detail she had set aside earlier, the one connected most closely to Emily Waters. She walked the short distance across the green to the row of cottages where Emily and her aunt lived. The front door stood ajar to let in the fresh air. From inside came the faint clink of teacups and the murmur of voices. Miss Marple knocked lightly and was invited in by Emily herself. The girl looked brighter than she had the week before, not transformed but eased, as though some tightness in her shoulders had loosened. She offered tea, which Miss Marple accepted, and they sat again in the small parlour. The photograph of Uncle Robert still stood on the mantel, but beside it now was a tiny vase holding 3 fresh violets. "I saw you at the memorial this morning," Emily said after a moment. "Were you looking for something?" "In a way," Miss Marple replied. "I noticed a note there, under the stone. I didn't read it all, but I saw enough. It was from Mr. Harraway to his brother." Emily nodded slowly. "He told me about it yesterday. He came by in the afternoon. First time he's ever knocked on our door. He said he wanted me to know that the violets weren't just for Tom. They were for Robert too, in a way, because they'd been friends and because the same bitterness had touched us all." She looked at the photograph. "Auntie used to say the war didn't end in 1918. It went on in people's heads. Mr. Harraway carried it longest, I think, but when he let it go it was like permission for us." Auntie cried when he told her, not sad tears, just releasing ones. She said she felt lighter too. Miss Marple sipped her tea. The pattern was clearer now, almost complete. On Easter morning, while the congregation sang of resurrection, Mr. Harraway had quietly ended his private war. The killing was the death of resentment. Resentment toward fate, toward those who had survived when Tom had not, toward his own helplessness. He had chosen the day deliberately. Easter, the day when death itself was overcome. The violets were the marker, small and unshowy, like the act itself. And the ripple had spread. Emily, who had avoided the memorial for years because it carried too much weight, had begun to walk past it again. Her aunt had spoken Robert's name without the old catch in her voice. Mrs. Price no longer glanced toward empty gates with quite the same anxiety. Her own husband's memories, tied to the same battalion, seemed less heavy when shared in small ways. Miss Marple thought how often the deepest changes happen unseen. No speeches, no ceremonies. Only one person deciding in the quiet of a church pew to bury what had poisoned him for decades. The title, The Easter Morning Killing, no longer pointed to darkness, it pointed to light. Not a life taken, but a long, slow dying ended at last. The true direction of the mystery was not crime, but healing. Slow, private, and perfectly timed with the season of renewal. She finished her tea and set the cup down. "You've put violets here now," she observed, nodding toward the mantel. Emily smiled. A real smile, small but warm. "Yes, Mr. Harraway brought them yesterday. He said they were the last of the wild ones this year. He thought Robert might like them, and Tom too." Miss Marple rose to go. At the door she paused. "Sometimes," she said gently, "the hardest person to forgive is oneself. When that happens, everything else becomes possible." Emily nodded. "I think that's what he did, and we're all a little freer for it." Miss Marple walked home in the strengthening sunshine. The lanes were quiet. A blackbird sang from the top of a hawthorn. She passed the war memorial once more and this time stopped for a moment. No violets remained, no note. Someone had tidied it away. Perhaps the sexton, perhaps the wind and rain. But the stone looked different now, not changed but somehow less burdened. She reached her garden gate, let herself in, and sat for a while on the bench under the apple tree. The shawl was finished. She had tied off the last thread the night before. Tomorrow she would give it to Mrs. Bantry's niece, who was expecting her first child. Life continuing as it does. The mystery had turned fully now. What had seemed a puzzle of odd behaviour and small gestures had revealed its heart. An Easter morning killing that was no killing at all, but the gentlest of deaths, the death of old sorrow, so new life could take root. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the sun warm on her face. All the details had found their places. There was nothing more to chase, only to let be. Chapter 6. Quiet Explanation. A few days later, when the tulips were at their brightest and the village had settled back into its ordinary rhythm, Miss Marple decided it was time for a small private conversation. She baked a plain Victoria sponge that morning, light, not too sweet, with a thin layer of raspberry jam and a dusting of icing sugar, wrapped it carefully in greaseproof paper, and walked the short distance to Mr. Haraway's cottage at the edge of the lane. The gate, usually half latched and creaking, stood properly closed for once. Smoke rose in a thin, steady column from the chimney. A faint scent of wood smoke mingled with the smell of damp earth. She knocked twice gently, and after a moment the door opened. Mr. Haraway looked surprised but not displeased. He wore his usual tweed waistcoat, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his hands were dusted with soil from the garden. "Miss Marple," he said, wiping his palms on an old cloth, "this is unexpected. Won't you come in?" The parlour was small and sparsely furnished, a fireside chair with worn arms, a low table, a shelf of books mostly about birds and the countryside, and a single framed photograph on the mantel. Two young men in uniform, arms around each other's shoulders, are grinning at the camera as though the world would last forever. One was unmistakably Tom Haraway. The other, Miss Marple recognised from Emily's mantle, was Robert Simpkins. Mr. Haraway offered tea, weak without milk, the way he always made it, and they sat opposite one another in the two fireside chairs. The kettle sang softly on the hob. Neither spoke for a minute or two. The silence was companionable, not awkward. Miss Marple set the wrapped cake on the table between them. "I thought you might like something sweet with your tea," she said. "It's nothing grand." He unwrapped it slowly, looked at the neat sponge, and gave a small nod. "Kind of you. I don't bake much these days." When the tea was poured and the cake cut into modest slices, Miss Marple spoke. "I've been thinking about Easter morning," she began, her voice as calm as ever. "About the violets you placed at the memorial, and about what you told Mrs. Price afterward, that it was a killing, but not the sort anyone would expect." Mr. Haraway looked down at his cup. His fingers, rough from years of work, turned the handle slowly. "You've pieced it together, then?" "Most of it," she said gently. "The rest I hoped you might tell me yourself, if you wished." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire settled with a small crackle. Outside, a blackbird sang from the hedge. "I carried it for nearly 40 years," he said at last. "The anger, not loud anger, the quiet kind that eats away at you. Tom was younger than me by 3 years. Bright, quick to laugh. When the telegram came in 17, something in me stopped. I blamed the war, the officers, the politicians. Most of all, I blamed myself for not being there to look after him. I was invalided out early, shrapnel in the leg, nothing heroic. I came home and he didn't. That seemed wrong, unfair, and I let it grow into a wall. He took a sip of tea, set the cup down carefully. I kept people at a distance, didn't join in village things, didn't want pity, didn't want questions. The memorial became a place I avoided, except when duty made me go. But the bitterness stayed. It was like carrying a stone in my pocket, heavy, always there. I told myself it was loyalty to Tom, honouring his memory. But it wasn't. It was punishing myself and punishing everyone else by staying apart. Miss Marple listened without comment, her hands folded in her lap. Easter this year was different, he went on. I went to the service not because I felt religious, but because the church was warm and the hymns were familiar. The vicar spoke about the empty tomb, about how death isn't the end, about forgiveness being part of rising again. I'd heard it all before, but that morning the words reached me. I sat there thinking of Tom. Not the boy who died, but the boy who laughed, who shared his sweets, who wanted to be a carpenter like our father. And I realized the anger wasn't honouring him. It was keeping him trapped in the war, and me with him. He looked across at the photograph on the mantel. So I chose. Right there, during the last hymn. I let it go. I forgave the war for taking him. I forgave the people who couldn't stop it. And hardest of all, I forgave myself for surviving. It wasn't dramatic, no tears, no voice from heaven, just a decision. The bitterness died in that moment. I killed it. That was the Easter morning killing. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And the violets? A marker, he said. Something small to say it was finished. Violets grow wild where no one tends them. Tough, quiet. I thought Tom might like that, and Robert too. He was Tom's friend. They died the same week. Emily's uncle. I never spoke to her properly before, but after that morning I went to see her and her aunt, told them what I'd done. It seemed only right. He paused, then added quietly, Emily said it helped her. Her aunt too. They'd been carrying their own sorrow, tied to the same names on the stone. When I laid mine down, it made theirs lighter. Miss Marple smiled, the small, understanding smile she reserved for moments like this. Small things matter, Mr. Harraway. One person's peace can give permission to others. But you didn't set out to change the village, you only set out to change yourself. But the change spreads quietly. He looked at her for a long moment. You see a great deal, Miss Marple. I see what's in front of me, she replied. People's habits, their glances, the things they don't say, and sometimes the things they finally do. They sat in silence again, companionable and unhurried. The tea cooled in their cups. Outside, the blackbird moved to another branch and began a new phrase. At length Miss Marple rose. I won't keep you longer. Thank you for telling me. Thank you for listening, he said, standing to see her out. At the door he hesitated. I'm going to the Thursday tea at the vicarage next week. First time in years. If you'll be there. I shall, she said. And I look forward to seeing you there. She walked home along the lane, the sun warm on her back, the air sweet with spring. The explanation was complete now. Not dramatic, not clever in any showy way, but clear and human. Mr. Harraway had killed nothing and no one. He had simply ended a long self-imposed sentence of grief and isolation. The title made sense at last, an Easter morning killing that was an act of life, timed with the church bells and the resurrection story so that something better could begin. She reached her own gate, let herself in, and sat for a while in the garden with her face turned to the sun. The lilacs were nearly over, but the roses were coming on strong. Life continued as it always did, small, steady, and full of quiet possibilities. Chapter 7. Peaceful Resolution. The weeks that followed Easter brought the gentle unfolding of spring in St. Mary Mead to its fullest. The lilacs finished their bloom and dropped their petals in soft drifts across garden paths. The roses opened one by one, first the pale pink ones against Miss Marple's cottage wall, then the deeper reds farther down the lane. Days lengthened until twilight lingered past 8 o'clock, and the village seemed to breathe more easily, as though the air itself had been waiting for something to settle. Mr. Harraway began to appear more often beyond the gate of his cottage. At first it was small things. He walked to the post office on pension day without hurrying away, exchanged a few words with the butcher about the price of lamb, even paused on the green to watch children playing cricket with a soft leather ball. Then came the Thursday teas at the vicarage, a gathering of mostly older ladies who brought scones or seed cake and talked quietly of parish matters. Mr. Harraway arrived the first time with a slight hesitation at the door, but Mrs. Haydock welcomed him with the same warmth she gave everyone, and soon he was seated with a cup of tea and a slice of Victoria sponge, the very one Miss Marple had baked and shared with him days before. He spoke little at those teas, but he listened. When someone mentioned the war memorial needing a fresh coat of whitewash before Remembrance Sunday, he offered quietly that he had a tin of paint left in his shed and could help if needed. No one made a fuss. No one praised him overly. They simply nodded. I said that would be kind, and passed the plate of biscuits. The change was so gradual it felt almost natural, like a tree coming into leaf after a long winter. Emily Waters, too, moved differently now. She no longer took the long way round the green to avoid the memorial. She walked straight past it, sometimes pausing to read the names with a calm face rather than a shadowed one. She began helping more regularly with the church flowers, choosing violets when they were in season and mixing them with white daisies in simple jars for the side chapel. Her aunt, Mrs. Simpkins, grew stronger as the spring warmed. The cough eased, and she ventured out to sit on the bench by her front door, watching the world go by. Once, when Miss Marple called with a bottle of elderflower cordial, Mrs. Simpkins spoke of Robert without the old tremble in her voice. He'd have been pleased, she said, to know the bitterness ended at last, for all of us. Mrs. Price noticed the difference most of all. She no longer glanced toward empty gates with that faint, habitual worry. Her husband's name was on the memorial too, lost in the same terrible week as Tom and Robert, and though she had never carried the same anger as Mr. Harraway, she had carried a quiet sorrow that had shadowed her days. Now, when she locked the post office at midday, she sometimes walked the few steps to the churchyard and stood for a moment beside the stone cross, not in grief, but in something closer to acceptance. She told Miss Marple one afternoon, over tea in the garden, "It's as though a door closed softly, not locked, but closed, and the room behind it can finally rest." Miss Marple listened, nodding, her knitting needles moving steadily on a new piece. Pale blue booties for Mrs. Bantry's expected grandchild. She said little in reply, only that small changes, when they come from the heart, have a way of spreading farther than one expects. The village felt subtly lighter. Conversations on the green lasted a little longer. Laughter came more easily from open windows. Even the children seemed to play with less noise and more contentment. Nothing dramatic had happened, no grand announcement, no public confession, yet the air had cleared. Old silences had been broken, not with words shouted, but with words spoken quietly, or sometimes not spoken at all, only lived. One late April evening, Miss Marple walked once more to the churchyard as the sun was setting. The sky was streaked with rose and gold. The yew trees stood dark against it. She approached the war memorial slowly, her shoes soft on the grass. The stone looked the same as ever, weathered, steady, the names unchanging, yet it no longer seemed to carry quite the same weight. She stood for a moment, reading the familiar list: Tom Harroway, Robert Simpkins, and the others who had gone from this small place to fields far away. No violets lay at the foot now. The season for them had passed. Instead, a single white daisy, perhaps dropped by a child earlier in the day, rested against the base. Miss Marple smiled at it. Small, unasked-for tokens of life continuing. She thought back to Easter morning, the bells ringing across the fields, the lilies white in every window, the congregation singing of life risen from death, and in the midst of it all one man in a back pew had made a private choice, to kill the bitterness he had nursed so long. Not a murder, not a crime, but a necessary ending. The Easter morning killing had been the death of sorrow's long grip, so that forgiveness and peace could take its place. Everything had followed from that single, silent act. Not because Mr. Harroway had intended to change the village, he had intended only to change himself, but because peace, once chosen, invites others to choose it too. Emily had felt permission to walk past the memorial without heaviness. Mrs. Simpkins had spoken her nephew's name with gentleness. Mrs. Price had stopped waiting for something lost to return, and Mr. Harroway himself had begun, step by small step, to live among his neighbours again. Miss Marple turned from the memorial and walked home through the deepening dusk. Lights came on in the cottage windows. The scent of wood smoke drifted on the air. She let herself into her own house, hung her coat, and lit the lamp in the drawing room. The fire was already laid. She touched a match to it and watched the flames catch. She sat in her favourite chair, the knitting basket at her side. The booties were nearly finished, tiny, perfect, full of hope for a new life soon to arrive. She picked them up and worked a few more rows, the needles clicking softly in the quiet room. Outside, St. Mary Mead settled into night. The church clock struck the hour with its familiar measured chime. All was as it should be, quiet, orderly, restored. Not perfect, no village ever is, but peaceful and whole in a way it had not been for many years. Miss Marple smiled to herself, a small satisfied smile. The mystery was complete. The title, The Easter Morning Killing, now made perfect, gentle sense. Not an act of violence on a spring Sunday, but an act of release, the quiet, deliberate ending of old pain so that life could rise again, fresh and unburdened. She set the knitting aside, turned down the lamp, and sat for a while longer in the firelight. The house was warm, the night outside calm. Somewhere in the village Mr. Harroway would be sitting by his own fire, perhaps looking at the photograph of two young men who had once laughed together. and he would feel, at last, that their memory could rest in light rather than shadow. Sleep well, dear listener. The village rests, the spring moves gently onward, and so may you. A good night. Chapter 8. The Quiet. Afterglow. Summer arrived in St. Mary Mead without hurry, the way the best seasons do. June brought long golden evenings and the scent of cut grass drifting from every lawn. July followed with roses in full riot and the hum of bees among the lavender borders. By August the harvest was beginning in the fields beyond the village, and the sky held that deep, endless blue that makes one feel the world has always been this peaceful and always will be. Miss Marple sat in her garden most afternoons now, under the shade of the old apple tree whose fruit was already small and hard, but promising. She had finished the pale blue booties months ago and sent them to Mrs. Bantry's niece, who had replied with a photograph of the newborn wrapped in soft wool. The picture stood on the mantel now, and next to a small vase of late sweet peas. Life moved forward in small steady increments, each one carrying its own quiet satisfaction. The Thursday teas at the vicarage had become a fixture. Mr. Harraway attended nearly every week, bringing sometimes a jar of honey from the hives he had started keeping behind his cottage, sometimes nothing at all except his presence. The ladies had grown accustomed to him. They no longer lowered their voices when he entered the room. Conversation flowed around him as naturally as water around a stone that has lain long in the stream. He spoke of birds he had seen on his walks, of the new roses he was trying against the south wall, of how the bees seemed calmer this year than last. Simple things, safe things. The sort of talk that needs no deeper meaning to be worthwhile. One warm August afternoon, after the tea things had been cleared away and most of the ladies had drifted home, Mr. Harraway remained behind with Miss Marple and Mrs. Haydock in the vicarage garden. The three of them sat on wrought-iron chairs beneath a pergola heavy with clematis, the purple flowers hanging like lanterns above their heads. A tray with fresh lemonade rested on the low table. Ice clinked faintly as it melted. Mrs. Haydock excused herself after a little while to see to the evening meal, leaving the two old friends alone. They sat in comfortable silence for some minutes, watching a pair of swallows dart low over the lawn, hunting insects in the late light. At length Mr. Harraway spoke. "I never thanked you properly," he said. Miss Marple tilted her head. "For what, my dear man?" "For listening, for not pressing, for seeing what was happening without making a fuss about it." He looked across the garden, not quite meeting her eyes. "I'd grown so used to being alone with my thoughts that I forgot other people could understand without needing everything explained. You never asked me to justify anything. You simply waited until I was ready to say it myself." Miss Marple smiled gently. Sometimes the kindest thing one can do is let a thing unfold in its own time. Like a rose, push the petals open too soon and you spoil the bloom. He nodded slowly. That Easter morning feels a long way off now, almost like someone else's life. But I still remember the moment it changed, sitting in the pew, the organ playing, the light coming through the window, and the sudden knowledge that I didn't have to carry the stone anymore. I could put it down. And once I did, everything else started moving again. He paused, then added quietly, "Emily's aunt died last month, peacefully in her sleep. Emily came to tell me herself the next day. She said her aunt had smiled just before the end, as though she saw Robert waiting. And she thanked me thanked me for giving her those last few months without the old shadow over everything. Miss Marple reached for her glass of lemonade and took a small sip. The ice had nearly gone. The drink was cool and faintly sweet. Grief doesn't vanish, she said, but it can change shape. It stops being a wall and becomes a path, something one can walk along instead of something one is trapped behind. Mr. Harroway looked at her then directly. You've seen a great deal of that in your time, haven't you? Enough, she answered simply. See, enough to know that the deepest wounds are often the quietest, and that healing them is rarely loud. They sat on as the sun dipped lower, turning the clematis flowers to soft amethyst against the sky. A breeze stirred the leaves. Somewhere down the lane a child laughed, the sound carrying clear and bright. Eventually Mr. Harroway rose. I should be getting back. The bees will be settling for the night. Miss Marple stood too. Give them my regards, she said with a small smile. And come again next Thursday. I believe Mrs. Price is bringing her lemon curd tarts. He gave a rare, genuine chuckle. I wouldn't miss them. He walked away down the path, his step lighter than it had been even a year before. Miss Marple watched him go, then turned back toward her own cottage as the first stars began to show. That evening she sat by her open window with a cup of weak tea, listening to the village settle into darkness. An owl called once from the churchyard yews. A bat fluttered past the pane. The war memorial stood silent under the moon, its name silvered by light, no longer the centre of unspoken pain, but simply part of the landscape, remembered, honoured, and at rest. The Easter morning killing had been complete long ago. What remained was its gentle aftermath. Lives no longer held in check by old sorrow, small kindnesses exchanged without strain, the ordinary days allowed to be ordinary once more. No one spoke of miracles, no one needed to. The miracle had been ordinary in the extreme, one man deciding, in the hush of a resurrection hymn, to forgive himself and let the rest follow. Miss Marple finished her tea, set the cup aside, and drew a light shawl around her shoulders. She looked out at the garden one last time, the roses still blooming, the sweet peas climbing, the apple tree heavy with promise. All was well, all was quiet, all was as it should be. She turned from the window, extinguished the lamp, and made her way upstairs to bed. The house creaked softly around her, familiar and comforting. Outside, St. Mary Mead slept under a sky full of stars, and somewhere in that peaceful dark, the memory of an Easter morning lingered, not as tragedy, but as the beginning of something gentler, something kinder, something that had needed only to be chosen. Sleep well, dear listener. The seasons turn, the village dreams, and peace, true quiet peace, holds the night. Good night. Chapter 9, The Unhurried Seasons. September arrived in St. The Mary Mead, with the first cool mornings and the soft rustle of leaves beginning to turn. The roses, having given their all through the summer, now bore hips heavy with scarlet. The apple tree in Miss Marple's garden dropped its first ripe fruit into the grass with quiet thuds that sounded almost like contented sighs. The village moved into the slower cadence of autumn, bonfires smouldering in back gardens on Saturday evenings, children returning to school with new satchels and polished shoes, the hedgerows thick with blackberries waiting to be picked. Miss Marple walked the lanes more often now, a light scarf around her shoulders against the morning chill. She carried a small trug sometimes, gathering windfalls or the last of the sweet peas before the first frost. On one such walk she met Emily Waters coming the other way, basket over her arm filled with late runner beans and a few tomatoes still warm from the sun. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Emily said, her voice brighter than it had been even in spring. "I was just taking these to Mrs. Price. She's making chutney today and said she'd run short." Miss Marple smiled. "A kind thought. And how are you managing, my dear?" Emily paused, looking down at the vegetables as though they held the answer. "Better than I expected. The house feels different without Auntie, but not empty. More like she's still here in the little things, the way the curtains hang, the scent of lavender she kept in the drawers. And Mr. Harroway comes by sometimes, brings honey or just sits for a cup of tea. He doesn't talk much, but it's nice having someone there." They walked together a little way, so the lane was quiet save for the occasional bicycle bell or the distant lowing of cattle being brought in for milking. "I keep the photograph on the mantel," Emily continued, "and I added one of Auntie last Christmas, smiling by the fire. It feels right now, not heavy, just part of the room." Miss Marple nodded. "Memory doesn't have to be a burden, it can be company." They parted at the corner, Emily turning toward the post office, Miss Marple continuing toward the churchyard. She had developed the habit of stopping there once or twice a week, not to mourn, but to sit for a moment on the bench beneath the yews and watch the light change on the stones. The war memorial looked different in autumn light, softer, less stark. A few late Michaelmas daisies had self-seeded at its base, their white petals trembling in the breeze. No one had planted them. They had simply arrived as though the ground itself had decided some gentleness was due. Miss Marple sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and let her thoughts drift. Nearly half a year had passed since that Easter morning. The killing, the true killing, had been so small, so private, that anyone passing the church that day would have seen nothing unusual, only an elderly man laying a posy of violets and walking away. Yet from that single choice, everything had rippled outward. Mr. Harroway had begun to live among his neighbours again, not as a stranger who had once been one of them, but as a man who had returned. Emily had learned she could grieve without being consumed. Mrs. Price had found the courage to speak her husband's name without the old catch of pain. Even the vicar had remarked, in an offhand way during one of the Thursday teas, that the congregation seemed a little fuller lately, a little warmer. None of it had required speeches or resolutions or public gestures. It had required only one person deciding, quietly, irrevocably, to end the sentence he had passed on himself. The rest had followed like dawn following night, naturally, inevitably, without force. Miss Marple thought how often people imagined change must be dramatic to be real. A thunderclap, a revelation, tears in front of witnesses. But the deepest shifts were usually the quietest. A decision made in the middle of a hymn, a posy laid at the foot of stone, a door opened after years of being closed, small acts, almost invisible, yet they altered the air of an entire village. She rose after a while, brushed a leaf from her skirt, and walked home. The sun was low now, casting long shadows across the green. Children called to one another as they played tag around the maypole. A woman hung washing on a line, the sheets billowing like sails. Ordinary life continuing. That evening Miss Marple sat by her fire with a cup of cocoa and the last of the seed cake Mrs. Price had sent round earlier in the week. She opened her knitting basket, a new project, a warm cardigan in soft heather colours for the coming winter. and began the first row. The needles moved in their familiar rhythm, steady and unhurried. Outside, the village settled into dusk. Lights appeared in cottage windows one by one. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin blue columns. Somewhere a dog barked once, then fell silent. The church clock struck the hour with its calm, measured chime. Miss Marple looked toward the window, and though the curtains were drawn against the chill, she pictured the war memorial under the rising moon, the daisy heads closed for the night, the names on the bronze plaques silvered and still. She pictured Mr. Harroway in his parlour, perhaps reading by lamplight or simply sitting, listening to the quiet of his own house, a quiet no longer lonely. She pictured Emily folding sheets or arranging tomorrow's flowers for the church, her movements easy, her face calm. The Easter morning killing had been finished long ago. What remained was its fruit, not spectacular, not loud, but real. A village a little kinder to itself, neighbours a little closer, sorrow given its proper place, remembered, honoured, but no longer allowed to rule. She finished the row, turned the work, and began the next. Click, click. The fire burned low and steady. The house held her gently, as it always had. In time she set the knitting aside, turned down the lamp, and climbed the stairs to bed. The night outside was cool and clear, stars sharp above the rooftops. St. Mary Mead slept, peaceful and whole, and in that peace, the unhurried peace of seasons turning, of small choices bearing fruit over months and years, the story of the Easter morning killing found its final, gentle close. Not with fanfare, but with the soft sound of life continuing, day after ordinary day, under the same quiet sky. Sleep well, dear listener. The seasons keep their promise, the village dreams on, and so may you. Good night. Chapter 10. Echoes of a Gentle. Spring October came softly to St. Mary Mead, painting the beech trees copper and gold, turning the lanes into tunnels of warm colour that rustled underfoot with every step. The mornings carried a crisp edge now. Breath showed faintly in the air until the sun rose higher. Miss Marple lit the fire earlier each day, enjoying the small ritual of laying kindling, striking a match, watching the flames catch and spread. The house smelled of wood smoke and apples. A bowl of them sat on the sideboard, some still perfect, others beginning to wrinkle with age. One afternoon, when the light was already slanting low across the garden, she received a visitor she had half expected for weeks. Emily Waters knocked at the front door just after 4 o'clock. She carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, and her cheeks were pink from the walk in the cool air. "Come in, my dear," Miss Marple said, opening the door wider. "The kettle's just on. You'll have tea, I hope." They settled in the drawing room, the fire crackling pleasantly. Emily set the parcel on the low table between them. "I've been meaning to bring this for a while," she said. "It's nothing grand, but I thought you might like it." Miss Marple unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay a small hand-stitched cushion cover in soft lavender wool, embroidered with a simple spray of violets in silk thread. The stitches were neat, the colours true to the wild flowers that had once grown thick in the hedgerows. "I made it myself," Emily explained. "Over the summer. I kept thinking of that Easter morning, the violets Mr. Harroway brought, and how everything changed after. It seemed right to keep the memory in something warm, something useful." Miss Marple ran her fingers lightly over the embroidery. "It's beautiful, Emily, truly. I shall keep it on the chair by the window where the light falls in the mornings." They drank tea and talked quietly of the new term at the school where Emily now helped part-time, of the honey Mr. Harroway had given her last week. He says the bees did especially well this year, of how the cottage felt larger without her aunt, but also somehow fuller with small new habits. Emily spoke of visiting the war memorial more often now, not to linger in sorrow, but to leave a flower sometimes, or simply to stand and breathe. I used to think the names were accusations, she said. Now they feel more like reminders that people lived, loved, were lost, and still the world goes on, and we go on with it. Miss Marple nodded. Aye, that's wisdom, my dear. The past doesn't disappear, but it needn't hold the present hostage. After Emily had gone, promising to come again soon with some of her aunt's old recipe for blackberry jam, Miss Marple sat for a while longer with the cushion in her lap. The violets on the fabric looked almost alive in the firelight, their petals delicate but enduring. She thought how fitting it was, a small handmade thing born from the memory of an Easter morning that had ended nothing violently, but had quietly ended a long, unnecessary suffering. Later that week the village held its annual harvest festival in the church hall. Tables groaned under marrows, jars of pickles, loaves of bread still warm from ovens, and bowls of apples polished to a shine. Children ran between the stalls. Jay's small band played cheerful tunes on fiddle and accordion. Mr. Harroway was there, standing near the produce display, with a modest jar of his honey labelled simply Harroway Bees, Summer 2025. He wore a clean shirt and his best waistcoat. When Mrs. Price complimented the honey's colour, he answered with a quiet thank you, and even allowed himself a small smile. Miss Marple watched from a chair near the door, a cup of tea in her hand. She saw Emily helping with the children's games, saw the vicar moving among the crowd with his usual gentle bonhomie, saw neighbours who had once nodded stiffly to one another, now chatting easily. Nothing had been declared or celebrated in any formal way. No speeches had been made about forgiveness or renewal. Yet the change was there, woven into the ordinary fabric of village life, as natural as the turning of leaves. Toward the end of the evening, as the light outside faded to indigo, Mr. Harroway approached her chair. "Miss Marple," he said, "a word, if I may." They stepped outside into the cool night air. The stars were bright above the church tower. A thin moon hung low. "I've been thinking," he began, "about that morning in Easter. How one small choice, letting go of something I'd carried so long, changed more than I ever expected. Not just for me, for Emily, for her aunt while she was still here, for others I never even knew were watching." He paused, looking up at the sky. "I used to think peace was something you earned by suffering enough. Now I see it's something you choose and then keep choosing day after day. And when you do, it spreads. Like light through windows you didn't know were there." Miss Marple smiled softly. "You chose well, Mr. Harroway, and the village is the richer for it." They stood in silence a moment longer, the sounds of laughter and music drifting from the hall behind them. "I'll be going in now," he said at last. "But thank you again for being the sort of person who notices without judging." He walked back inside. Miss Marple remained outside a little while, breathing the crisp air, watching her breath mist faintly. Then she too returned to the warmth, said her good nights, and made her way home along the quiet lanes. In her own sitting room she lit the lamp, placed Emily's cushion on the chair by the window, and sat with a cup of cocoa. The fire had burned low. She added a small log and watched it catch. The story of the Easter morning killing was finished now, not because nothing more would happen, but because everything necessary had already happened. A bitterness had died quietly in a church pew. Forgiveness had taken its place, and from that single private act had grown a season of small steady healings. Conversations begun, silences broken, lives allowed to move forward without the old weight. Outside, St. Mary Mead slept under the autumn stars. The war memorial stood unchanged, yet somehow gentler in the moonlight. Somewhere a fox barked once in the distance. The village dreamed on, peaceful, ordinary, alive. Miss Marple finished her cocoa, turned down the lamp, and climbed the stairs to bed. The house settled around her with its familiar small sounds. She drew the blankets up, closed her eyes, and let the quiet take her. The seasons would turn again, winter, spring, another Easter. But the gentle killing of that long-ago morning had done its work. Sorrow had been given its place. Peace had been invited to stay. Sleep well, dear listener. The echoes of one spring morning linger still, soft and kind, carrying us gently toward whatever comes next. Good night.